I sat in my favorite rocking chair by the window, sipping warm chamomile tea and watching the sun slowly dip below the old oak trees in my backyard. My home. My fortress. The place where I'd raised my children, where my marriage to my beloved John had flourished, where every floorboard, every creak of the stairs held a lifetime of memories. I was 78, and every day spent here felt like a blessing. This house had been built by my grandfather, then passed to my father, and then to me. It wasn't just a building, it was the living history of our family, imbued with laughter, tears, celebrations, and quiet moments of joy. I had always believed that one day this house would go to my only granddaughter, Sarah. She was the daughter of my son, my dear David, who had, sadly, passed away too soon. Sarah was the only blood I had left for my son, and I loved her with all my heart, even though in recent years her character had become challenging. I'd always tried to be a good grandmother. I helped Sarah with her homework when she was little, baked her favorite apple pies, read bedtime stories. When she was older, I paid for her college education, even though my savings weren't as substantial back then. I believed in her, believed she would find her way and become a happy, successful person. But lately, something had changed. Sarah had grown distant, rarely called, and when she did visit, she acted as if she was doing me a great favor. I attributed it to youth, to the difficulties of adult life, but my heart told me something was truly amiss. On the morning of that fateful Tuesday, a day forever etched into my memory, I woke to a loud pounding on the door. Not just a knock, but persistent, aggressive thumps, as if someone was trying to break it down. My old heart began to pound, as I wasn't expecting any visitors. I walked to the door, clutching my chest, and peered through the peephole. Standing on my porch was Sarah. And she wasn't alone. Beside her was a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive but slightly rumpled suit, and another woman, younger than me, with a rather stern expression. I opened the door and Sarah immediately pushed past me, not bothering to wait for an invitation. Her eyes, which once held such warmth, were now cold and hard. "Grandma," she said, her voice devoid of any affection, "we need to talk." She stepped further into the living room, the man and the woman following her, making themselves entirely too comfortable in my home. The man carried a sleek, leather briefcase, which he set on my antique mahogany coffee table without a second thought. My heirloom, chipped by his careless disregard. "Sarah, what is the meaning of this?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a mix of confusion and a burgeoning sense of dread. My home, usually a sanctuary of peace, now felt invaded. Sarah turned to me, a smirk playing on her lips. "Meaning? It's quite simple, Grandma. This house, well, it's mine now. Legally." My breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" I looked at the man in the suit. "Who are you?" The man extended a business card. "Arthur Jenkins, attorney at law. And this," he gestured to the woman, "is Ms. Davies, our representative from the county's Adult Protective Services." Adult Protective Services? My mind reeled. Why would they be here? I had never needed assistance. I was perfectly capable of caring for myself. "You see, Grandma," Sarah continued, her voice dripping with an almost theatrical triumph, "I've been looking into things. Your health, your finances. It's all a bit much for you to handle, isn't it? Especially since you're, well, getting on in years." She looked around my pristine living room, a place I kept immaculate, as if searching for dust or disarray. "And this house, it's a valuable asset. Too valuable to just sit here with you rattling around in it." "Sarah, how dare you?" I felt a surge of anger, a fire I hadn't felt in years. "This is my home. My family's home. What are you implying?" Mr. Jenkins cleared his throat. "Mrs. Albright, your granddaughter has presented evidence suggesting that you are no longer capable of managing your affairs independently. Based on her concerns and some financial disclosures she's provided, the court has granted a temporary conservatorship. Miss Albright is now your legal conservator." My jaw dropped. Conservatorship? Without my knowledge? This was unthinkable. "What financial disclosures?" I demanded, my voice rising. "And how can a court grant something like this without hearing from me?" "Oh, it's all perfectly legal, Grandma," Sarah interjected, waving a hand dismissively. I showed them your bank statements. All those little withdrawals for gardening supplies and antique repairs. It looked a bit irresponsible. And remember that time you fell last year? I told them you're a danger to yourself. This is for your own good. The fall she referred to was a minor slip on a patch of ice last winter, resulting in nothing more than a bruised ego and a quick recovery. As for my bank statements, I meticulously managed my money, and my gardening supplies and antique repairs were investments in my home, not frivolous spending. Irresponsible? I've managed my finances perfectly my entire life. I retorted, my voice regaining its strength despite the shock. And I recovered from that fall in a week. This is preposterous. Preposterous or not, Mrs. Albright, Mr. Jenkins said, his voice flat and professional, the order is in place. And as Miss Albright's legal representative, I must inform you that she has decided to move into the property. Effective immediately. My world tilted. Move in? In my house? But where would I go? I stammered, looking from Sarah to the lawyer, then to the silent woman from APS, whose expression remained unreadable. Sarah laughed, a short, sharp sound that grated on my nerves. Oh, Grandma, don't be so dramatic. You'll be staying here, of course. For now. But as a tenant. You see, the conservatorship allows me to manage the property, and frankly, this house is too big for just one person. I'll be taking over the master bedroom, and you can stay in one of the smaller guest rooms upstairs. My master bedroom. The room I had shared with John for over 50 years. The very thought made my stomach churn. You can't be serious. You're turning me into a tenant in my own home? It's just until we figure things out, Grandma, Sarah said, though her tone suggested nothing of the sort. Besides, you'll be paying rent. It's only fair, considering I'll be managing everything now. We'll set up a modest amount, of course, to cover utilities and your contributions to the upkeep. My mind raced. Rent? In my own home? This was beyond disrespectful. It was a calculated insult, a brazen act of dispossession. I looked at the lawyer, then at the APS representative, seeking some sign of humanity, some hint that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But their faces remained impassive, their eyes reflecting only professional detachment. You have no rights here, Grandma. Now you're my tenant, Sarah repeated, her words like a venomous dart. She gestured towards Ms. Davies. Ms. Davies is here to ensure a smooth transition and to assess your living situation, for your safety, of course. Ms. Davies finally spoke, her voice surprisingly soft, but firm. Mrs. Albright, we understand this is difficult. However, our primary concern is your well-being. We need to ensure you have a safe and appropriate living environment. I have always had a safe and appropriate living environment, I exclaimed, gesturing around my well-maintained home. For 78 years. And now my own granddaughter is trying to steal it from me. It's not stealing, Grandma, Sarah said with an exasperated sigh. It's managing. It's taking responsibility. You just don't understand how things work anymore. She turned to Mr. Jenkins. Arthur, can we start getting things moved in? I have some boxes in the car. Mr. Jenkins nodded, already opening his briefcase and pulling out what looked like a stack of documents. My heart sank. This wasn't a discussion, it was an execution. They had planned this. Sarah had planned this. For months, perhaps. The thought of my sweet granddaughter orchestrating such a cruel act sent a cold shiver down my spine. I stood there, frozen, watching them. Sarah was already heading towards my bedroom, her heels clicking loudly on my polished hardwood floors. She was already mentally rearranging my furniture, claiming my space. The audacity, the sheer nerve of it, was breathtaking. My home, my sanctuary, was being desecrated, piece by piece, right before my eyes. As Sarah disappeared into my bedroom, I looked at Mr. Jenkins, who was already poring over documents, and Ms. Davies, who was calmly observing the room. A wave of helplessness washed over me, but then, deep within, something else began to stir. A flicker of defiance. They thought I was old, frail, and easily dismissed. They thought they could simply walk in and take what was mine. They thought I had no recourse, no fight left in me. But they were wrong. They were so utterly, completely wrong. I had spent a lifetime building this life, this home, this legacy. My mind, though older, was still sharp, and my spirit, though bruised, was far from broken. They had just underestimated me, and that, I knew, would be their biggest mistake. They didn't know about the small clause in my will, the one that would wipe the smile off her face. The one I had prepared for months, long before I ever suspected this betrayal. The one that was about to turn their grand scheme into a grand disaster. My initial shock gave way to a quiet determination. I smiled, a small, knowing smile that none of them saw. They thought they had won. But the game had only just begun. The question was not if I would fight back, but how. And the answer, when it came, would be far more devastating than they could ever imagine. The battle lines were drawn, not with shouts and accusations, but with cunning and a meticulously planned retribution that was just beginning to unfold. The next few days were a blur of calculated chaos. Sarah wasted no time. Boxes arrived almost immediately, filled with her possessions, which she unceremoniously dumped in my master bedroom. She had brought a new modern bed, a stark contrast to my antique four-poster, which was now relegated to the garage. She even brought her own minimalist, cold furniture, replacing my warm, familiar pieces with her stark, uninviting aesthetic. The scent of pine cleaner and lavender, which usually filled my home, was replaced by a cloying, sweet perfume and the faint smell of stale cigarettes that clung to Sarah's clothes. It felt as if a foreign body had invaded my sanctuary, systematically erasing my presence. Mr. Jenkins, the lawyer, returned the following day with a stack of documents for me to sign. They detailed the terms of the conservatorship, the rent I was now required to pay, an exorbitant $1,500 a month for a small guest room that barely fit my dresser and a single bed, and a host of other clauses that effectively stripped me of all financial control and decision-making power. He spoke in legal jargon, carefully avoiding direct eye contact, as if my very presence was an inconvenience. When I tried to argue, to point out the blatant injustices, he simply repeated, "It's all in the court order, Mrs. Albright. Miss Albright has been legally appointed." Sarah, meanwhile, was reveling in her newfound authority. She paraded around the house, giving orders to a cleaning crew she hired, strangers who touched my cherished belongings with rough, uncaring hands. She reorganized my kitchen, moving my beloved ceramic teacups and antique casserole dishes to high, inaccessible shelves, replacing them with her own sleek, stainless steel appliances that looked utterly out of place. She even started talking about modernizing the garden, hinting at tearing out the rose bushes John had planted for me decades ago. Each act was a deliberate, cutting blow, designed to remind me that I was no longer in charge, that this was no longer my home in any meaningful sense. "Grandma, don't forget to put your rent check on the counter by the 1st of next month," Sarah announced one evening as I tried to make myself a cup of tea in my now unfamiliar kitchen. "And please, try to be quieter when you come down at night. Your creaking around wakes me up." My heart ached with each condescending remark, each dismissive glance. This wasn't the granddaughter I had raised, the girl who used to curl up on my lap for stories. This was a stranger, driven by greed and a shocking lack of empathy. I saw the calculated gleam in her eyes, the hunger for what she perceived as her inheritance. She saw my home not as a legacy, but as a cash cow ripe for exploitation. The truth was, Sarah had always been a bit financially irresponsible. She'd cycled through jobs, always complaining about how little money she made, how unfair life was. I'd quietly helped her out with loans several times over the years, loans she never repaid. I remembered the last time, just a few months ago, when she'd called, sobbing, claiming she was about to be evicted from her tiny apartment. I'd sent her a substantial sum, thinking I was helping her get back on her feet. Now I saw it for what it was, a prelude to this grand scheme, a test of my generosity, and perhaps a way to gauge my current financial situation. The APS representative, Ms. Davies, made a perfunctory visit, asking me a series of impersonal questions about my daily routine, my eating habits, my general mood. Sarah hovered nearby, interjecting with comments about my forgetfulness or my need for supervision. I tried to maintain my composure, to calmly explain that I was perfectly fine, but Miss Davies's gaze was always drawn back to Sarah, whose portrayal of the concerned granddaughter seemed to hold more weight. The visit concluded with Miss Davies stating, "We'll continue to monitor the situation, Mrs. Albright. For now, it appears Miss Albright is providing adequate care." Adequate care. It felt like a verdict on my life, handed down by someone who barely knew me, based on lies. That night, alone in my cramped guest room, surrounded by boxes of Sarah's things waiting to be unpacked, I couldn't sleep. The silence of the house, broken only by Sarah's muffled television from what used to be my bedroom, felt oppressive. A deep sadness settled over me, a profound sense of loss and betrayal. But beneath the sadness, a flicker of that defiance I'd felt earlier began to grow stronger. I wasn't just a victim. I was a survivor. And I had a secret. Months ago, after my son David passed away, I had decided to update my will. It wasn't just about the house. It was about ensuring my legacy, protecting the memories, and making sure my assets were distributed wisely. I had chosen a small, discreet law firm downtown, recommended by my friend Agnes, a firm known for its meticulous attention to detail and, more importantly, its discretion. Attorney Miles Corbin had handled everything. He was a quiet, observant man, and I had been very specific about my wishes. Most importantly, I had included a particular clause. It wasn't about disinheritance, not directly. It was far more intricate, a subtle yet devastating twist. This clause was born not out of malice, but out of a lifetime of experience, seeing how family dynamics could warp under the pressure of money and entitlement. I had foreseen, to some extent, the potential for discord, though never imagined it would manifest in such a cruel, direct attack by my own flesh and blood. The clause was designed to protect the integrity of the property itself, to ensure it remained a home, not just a commodity. It was a failsafe, a final line of defense against anyone who sought to exploit its value without understanding its true worth. I lay awake, meticulously planning. I couldn't confront Sarah directly. She had the law, or at least a misinterpretation of it, on her side for now. I needed to be strategic, to play my hand carefully. The first step was to gather proof. I needed to document everything: Sarah's behavior, her financial demands, the neglect, the way she was actively making my life miserable. I pulled out a small, old diary from beneath my mattress, a gift from John on our first anniversary. It was filled with pressed flowers and faded memories, but now it would serve a new purpose. I began to write, detailing every incident, every hurtful word, every act of invasion. I dated each entry, determined to build an undeniable case. The next morning, I calmly approached Sarah as she ate breakfast, scrolling on her phone. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady, "I need access to my financial records. My bank statements, my investment accounts. As my conservator, you are legally obligated to provide them." She barely looked up. "Oh, Grandma, don't worry about that. I'm handling everything. It's too complicated for you." Nevertheless, I persisted, "I have a right to see them. I need to verify that everything is being managed correctly." She sighed, clearly annoyed. "Fine. I'll get them to you when I have time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a very important meeting." She picked up her designer handbag and left, slamming the front door behind her. Her dismissive attitude only solidified my resolve. She underestimated me at every turn. While she was out, probably at her very important meeting, which I suspected was more about leisurely shopping than actual work, I began my quiet investigation. I knew where I kept my old financial statements, tucked away in a locked box in the attic. My key was still on my keyring, untouched. Navigating the dusty attic, which Sarah hadn't yet deemed worthy of her modernization, I found the box. Inside, I found not only my old statements, but also copies of the will I had updated. I had kept them for my records, a habit ingrained from years of careful financial management. I reviewed the specific clause again, the one I had so carefully crafted with Attorney Corbin. It was airtight. It was designed to address precisely this kind of scenario. My heart swelled with a quiet sense of triumph. She might think she had me cornered, but I had built an escape route, a meticulously planned ambush. The following week, the tension in the house was palpable. Sarah continued to make her presence known, hosting loud parties with her friends who treated my home like a glorified frat house, leaving messes for me to clean up. She cut off my cable, saying it was an unnecessary expense, and insisted I only use the internet on her terms. My phone became her phone, used for her calls and social media, barely allowing me access to contact my few remaining friends. She openly discussed selling off Grandma's old junk, referring to my antique furniture and cherished keepsakes, to raise money for renovations. Each conversation was like a fresh stab wound. "This old table would fetch a good price at auction, don't you think?" she'd say, tapping my grandmother's Victorian side table with a painted fingernail, completely oblivious to its sentimental value. "We could get a really sleek, modern coffee table instead." I would just nod, my expression unreadable. I was learning to control my reactions, to hide the storm brewing within me. My silence was a weapon, my calm demeanor a shield. Let her believe she had won, that I was resigned to my fate. That was part of my plan. The more secure she felt, the harder she would fall. One evening, I overheard Sarah on the phone in what was once my study, now her makeshift office. "Yes, the appraisal came in lower than I hoped," she complained into the phone. "But once we get rid of some of her stuff and put in new fixtures, the value will skyrocket." "And the old woman?" "She's completely clueless. Thinks she's still in charge. She'll be out of here before she knows what hit her." Out of here. That phrase echoed in my mind. She intended to remove me completely. Not just make me a tenant, but eventually force me out of the home I'd lived in my entire life. The realization solidified my resolve. I would not allow it. My revenge would be silent, swift, and utterly devastating. I decided it was time to make my move. I carefully retrieved a small, sealed envelope I had hidden in the back of my old photo album. Inside was a single piece of paper, meticulously folded, and a key. This was the first domino. The trap was set. The next morning, I woke before Sarah. I dressed quietly, put on my walking shoes, and slipped out of the house before she could stir. The early morning air was crisp and cool, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. I walked quickly, my determination fueling my steps, until I reached the familiar brick building of Miles Corbin's law office. The receptionist, a kind young woman named Eleanor, greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Albright, it's good to see you. Mr. Corbin is expecting you." I smiled faintly. I had called him the previous evening, using a burner phone I kept for emergencies, a small act of foresight that Sarah hadn't yet discovered. I needed to speak to him in person, to put the final phase of my plan into motion. Miles Corbin was already in his office, his desk meticulously organized. He rose as I entered, a hint of concern in his eyes. "Eleanor mentioned you seemed troubled, Mrs. Albright. Is everything all right?" I sat down, taking a deep breath. "Mr. Corbin, it's about the will we updated. And a few other matters. My granddaughter, Sarah, has taken some liberties." I explained everything, concisely and clearly, from the conservatorship to her plans to sell my belongings and eventually evict me. I showed him the diary entries, the copies of the court order, everything I had meticulously documented. He listened patiently, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful frown on his face. "This is a severe abuse of her authority, Mrs. Albright. What she's doing is not only unethical, but potentially illegal under the guise of conservatorship. The court's order was likely based on a misrepresentation of facts." "I know," I said, "that's why I'm here." "Do you remember the specific clause we discussed? The one about the unconditional residency?" A spark lit in his eyes. "Ah, yes. The legacy clause, as I called it. A rather ingenious piece of foresight on your part, Mrs. Albright. It ensures that the property cannot be sold or mortgaged as long as certain conditions regarding its primary occupant are met, and it provides a clear path for legal redress if those conditions are violated." "And if it is violated?" I pressed, a quiet hope beginning to bloom in my chest. He smiled, a rare, thin smile. Then the entire will, particularly the distribution of assets, becomes immediately null and void, and a pre-existing, far more stringent and entirely different set of instructions comes into effect. One that, if memory serves, would leave Miss Albright with absolutely nothing from the estate and initiate immediate legal proceedings to restore your full ownership and control, along with significant penalties for her actions. My smile grew wider. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The small clause that would wipe the smile off her face was about to be unleashed. Sarah had been so focused on taking control, she had overlooked the fundamental safeguard I had built into my legacy. She thought she was playing chess, but she didn't realize I was playing a completely different game, one she couldn't possibly win. The pieces were now in place. The trap was about to spring. The atmosphere in my house became a pressure cooker. Sarah, emboldened by her perceived victory, grew increasingly brazen. She started inviting her friends over almost every night, treating my living room like a cheap lounge. Their laughter echoed through the halls, and the scent of fast food and cheap perfume permeated every corner of my once pristine home. She openly discussed selling off my antique collection, my mother's heirlooms, to fund what she called necessary upgrades to the house. Grandma's old junk, she'd sneer to her friends, but it'll fetch a pretty penny for a down payment on my new car. Each word was a fresh wound, but I simply smiled and nodded, observing, gathering more fuel for the inevitable explosion. I made daily, quiet trips to my local library, ostensibly to read, but in reality, to use their public computers and a secure, encrypted email service. Attorney Corbin had advised me to communicate with him only through this method, to avoid any possibility of Sarah intercepting my messages. We meticulously prepared our case. He explained the legal nuances of the legacy clause, a specific condition in my updated will that stipulated the property could not be sold, mortgaged, or used as collateral for a loan, nor could the primary resident, myself, be forced out or charged rent, without triggering a complete nullification of all bequests to the direct heir of my son. In simple terms, if Sarah violated these conditions, she would inherit absolutely nothing from me, and the house would be legally returned to my sole, unfettered ownership, with all her expenses and actions since the conservatorship deemed illegal. Furthermore, it would trigger a charitable trust in my late husband's name, which would receive the bulk of the estate's liquid assets, bypassing any direct family inheritance if the clause was breached. It was a clause I had added years ago, a quiet failsafe, knowing that inherited wealth could sometimes corrupt. The key, Mrs. Albright, Miles had explained, is proving her intent to violate these conditions and her active violation of the residency clause by charging you rent and attempting to force you out. Your diary entries, the rent checks, and her overheard conversations are crucial. The day finally came. A notice arrived via certified mail, addressed to the conservator of estate, Evelyn Albright. Sarah tore it open with a flourish, assuming it was some official document validating her control. Her eyes scanned the legal text, and her triumphant smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of confusion, then outright panic. "What is this?" she sputtered, waving the paper at me. It's a court summons. And a notice of breach of contract? What contract?" I calmly sipped my tea. "It's not a contract, dear. It's a clause. In my will." "Your will?" Her voice was shrill. "But that's for when you're gone. It's not supposed to affect anything now." "Oh, but it does," I replied, my voice sweet but firm. "It affects everything. Especially when you declare me a tenant in my own home, demand rent, and plan to sell my cherished possessions. Those are direct violations, Sarah. Very specific violations of a very specific clause." Before she could fully grasp the implications, the doorbell rang. It was Mr. Jenkins, looking flustered. Behind him stood Miles Corbin, his expression calm and professional, accompanied by a stern-faced woman who looked like a judge's assistant. "Mrs. Albright," Mr. Jenkins began, his voice strained, "this is highly irregular. Miss Albright has just shown me this document. What is the meaning of this unconditional residency clause?" Miles stepped forward. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins. I believe the document speaks for itself. My client, Mrs. Evelyn Albright, has initiated legal proceedings to dissolve the temporary conservatorship and regain full control of her assets, citing a clear breach of the legacy clause in her valid and legally executed last will and testament. Sarah's face was chalk white. But you can't. I'm the conservator. I have the power. Not anymore, Miss Albright, Miles stated. The legacy clause explicitly states that any attempt to displace Mrs. Albright from her primary residence, or to treat her as a tenant within it, or to dispose of her property without her express consent, automatically nullifies any and all inheritance you would otherwise receive from her estate. Furthermore, it triggers an immediate revocation of any conservatorship established under false pretenses related to her capacity or willingness to manage her own affairs. False pretenses? Sarah's voice cracked. I was only trying to help. Help or gain control of valuable property for your own benefit. Miles countered, his gaze piercing. The court will decide. But let me assure you, Miss Albright, Mrs. Albright has meticulously documented every instance of your alleged help, including your demands for rent, your plans to sell her belongings, and your overall disregard for her well-being and wishes. She has provided substantial evidence of your intent to dispossess her. Mr. Jenkins, looking increasingly uncomfortable, pulled Sarah aside. Sarah, is this true? Did you charge your grandmother rent? Did you plan to sell her antiques? Sarah stammered, well, it was just for the upkeep. And the antiques. I was just thinking about modernizing. Modernizing or liquidating assets you believed would soon be yours. Miles interjected, holding up a copy of one of her rent checks. This check, Miss Albright, signed by your grandmother under duress, is Exhibit A. The stern-faced woman, who introduced herself as a court liaison, spoke for the first time. Miss Albright, the judge has reviewed the initial filing. Given the serious nature of these allegations and the specific terms of Mrs. Albright's will, the court has granted a temporary injunction. The conservatorship is immediately suspended pending a full hearing. All your actions concerning Mrs. Albright's property and finances since the conservatorship was granted are now under judicial review. Any attempt to move, sell, or modify assets will be considered a contempt of court. Sarah looked from the court liaison to Miles, then to me, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. The realization of what she had done and the devastating consequences was finally sinking in. Her carefully constructed facade of control was crumbling before her eyes. And as for the house, Miles continued, the clause dictates that if the conditions are breached, the property reverts solely to Mrs. Albright, with no claim from you. Furthermore, a significant portion of the estate's liquid assets, far exceeding the value of this house, is now irrevocably designated for a charitable trust in the name of the John Albright Legacy Foundation, dedicated to supporting elder care and preserving historical homes. This was a provision Mrs. Albright put in place specifically to prevent her family from treating her cherished home and assets as mere commodities. Sarah's face went from pale to ghostly. The John Albright Legacy Foundation. That meant all the money she thought she'd eventually inherit, all the investments, the life savings, gone. Diverted to charity. Her carefully constructed future, built on my perceived demise, had just imploded. No, she shrieked, the composure she'd maintained for weeks completely shattering. You can't do this. This is my inheritance. My father's inheritance. It was your father's inheritance, dear, I said, my voice quiet but cutting through her hysteria, contingent on respect, integrity, and adherence to the values of this family. Values you clearly abandoned the moment you decided to treat me as a burden and my home as a mere investment. She lunged towards me, but Mr. Jenkins quickly restrained her. Sarah, calm down. You're making things worse. Miles handed a document to Mr. Jenkins. This is the full motion, including Mrs. Albright's sworn testimony and documented evidence. The hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday. I suggest you advise your client to prepare a very strong defense, though I doubt she has one. The court liaison added, Miss Albright, for the duration of this injunction, you are not to interact with Mrs. Albright without supervision. You are required to vacate the premises within 24 hours. Failure to comply will result in immediate arrest for trespass and further charges. Sarah stared at me, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and despair. You old witch. You planned this. You knew. I met her gaze, unflinching. I planned for contingencies, Sarah. I planned for the protection of my legacy and my peace. And I planned for a day when someone might try to take advantage of an old woman. It seems that day has come. She left in a storm of angry tears and slammed doors, Mr. Jenkins trailing behind her, looking utterly defeated. The court liaison stayed for a few more minutes, ensuring I felt safe and understood the next steps, then she too departed, leaving me alone in my house. My home. The silence that followed her departure was different from the oppressive silence of the previous weeks. This was a reclaiming silence, a peaceful quiet that settled back into the walls. I walked through the living room, touching my displaced furniture, looking at the marks left by Sarah's careless moving. It would take time to restore everything, but the sense of calm, of my rightful place being restored, was already profound. A few weeks later, the court hearing took place. Sarah, under the strained guidance of Mr. Jenkins, attempted to argue that her actions were out of genuine concern for my well-being, that the rent was merely a contribution to household expenses, and that the legacy clause was overly punitive and unfairly restrictive. But Miles Corbin presented my meticulously documented evidence, the diary entries, the copies of the rent checks I had been forced to write, the witnesses who had overheard her plans to sell my belongings, and expert testimony on my sound mental and physical health. He painted a clear picture of calculated financial exploitation and emotional abuse. The judge, an imposing but fair woman, listened intently. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she faltered, her lies unraveling under the weight of the evidence. She became defensive, then tearful, but her performance failed to sway the court. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The temporary conservatorship was permanently dissolved, and Sarah was ordered to pay back all rent collected from me, plus damages for emotional distress and legal fees incurred. Most importantly, the judge upheld the validity of the legacy clause in my will, declaring that Sarah's actions constituted a clear and deliberate breach. This meant she would receive absolutely no inheritance from my estate, and the John Albright Legacy Foundation would indeed receive the designated funds upon my passing, a far greater sum than she could have ever hoped to gain from manipulating me. The house was unequivocally mine, with clear legal protections against any future attempts to seize it. The news spread through our small community like wildfire. Many of my friends, who had quietly worried about me, came by to express their support and admiration for my courage. Sarah's reputation was in tatters. Her friends quickly abandoned her, seeing her for the manipulative person she truly was. Mr. Jenkins, undoubtedly embarrassed by the whole affair, dropped her as a client. Sarah tried to call me a few times in the following weeks, leaving frantic, tearful messages, begging for forgiveness, trying to explain herself away. But there was no explaining away such a profound betrayal. I never returned her calls. The bridges between us had been burned, not by my hand, but by her own greed and disrespect. I spent the next few months slowly restoring my home, putting my furniture back in its rightful place, tending to my garden, replanting the rose bushes that Sarah had threatened to remove. I felt a renewed sense of purpose and peace. My house was more than just a structure. It was a symbol of resilience, of wisdom triumphing over avarice. One afternoon, a few months after the verdict, I received a thick envelope in the mail. It was from Sarah. Inside was a single, handwritten letter. It was rambling and full of self-pity, but buried within the lines, almost grudgingly, was an apology. Not a heartfelt one, not one that truly understood the depth of her transgressions, but an acknowledgement of her mistakes. She admitted, almost reluctantly, that she had underestimated me, that she had been blinded by greed, and that she now faced financial difficulties as a result of her own actions. She had lost her apartment, her job, and her reputation. She was truly alone. I sighed, a long, weary sigh. I felt no joy in her suffering, only a profound sadness for the person she had become. I had not sought to destroy her, only to protect myself and what was rightfully mine. The retribution had been subtle, legal, and rooted in the very foresight she had so carelessly disregarded. It wasn't about revenge in the cruel sense, but about justice and the reaffirmation of principles. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I wouldn't respond. There was nothing more to say. My life, my home, my peace had been restored. The lesson had been learned, albeit at great cost to all involved. My story wasn't just about winning a legal battle, it was about the enduring power of an elder's wisdom, the quiet strength that comes from a lifetime of experience, and the unwavering resolve to stand up for what is right, even against those you once loved. It was a testament that, even in the twilight years, one's spirit can burn brighter than ever, illuminating the path to justice and reclaiming one's dignity. My home, filled once again with quiet peace and cherished memories, was a silent monument to that triumph.